About a century and a half before our story begins, the Assyrian capital of Nineveh received a terrifying warning from the prophet Jonah. To the shock of the ancient world, the city actually listened. They repented and they received divine mercy. But that behavior didn't stick. By the 7th century BC, the Assyrian Empire had aggressively relapsed into a machine of systemic violence, conquering neighboring nations and crushing them under crippling oppression. So a new prophet arrives, but this time the message is completely different. There is no call to repent, and there is no second chance on the table. The decree is an absolute, unavoidable shutdown of the empire. When a nation takes the mercy it was given and uses it to build a multi-generational system of terror, the window for patience eventually closes. God's judgment becomes absolute. By this point in history, Nineveh had earned a grim title, the City of Blood. They were the apex predator of the Near East, bullying smaller nations like the Kingdom of Judah into submission and extracting endless wealth. Assyrian elites governed through calculated physical terror. Their own historical records openly boast of skinning enemy leaders alive and decorating their royal gardens with the severed heads of opposing kings. We can see the evidence of this brutality carved into their own palace walls, a permanent monument to how they treated anyone who resisted them. Into this nightmare steps a prophet from Judah named Nahum. Ironically, his name literally translates to the word comfort. To the elites of Nineveh, his message is a terrifying death sentence, but for the traumatized victims living under Assyrian rule, watching the violent destruction of their oppressor is exactly that, profound comfort. Nahum dismantles Nineveh's state propaganda through a series of cutting symbolic reversals, mocking the very images they once used to inspire terror. The lion served as the primary symbol of Assyrian military power. It was an image of an invincible, global predator that hunted neighboring nations for sport. Nahum takes that prized symbol and flips it. He describes the imperial lion as wounded and hunted, completely incapable of protecting its own cubs. He taunts the Assyrian elites directly, asking a pointed question: where is the lion's den now? By hijacking their own ideological messaging, Nahum strips away the empire's mythological aura. He reclassifies the world's most terrifying hunters as the prey. The Assyrians also bragged that their massive armies were like a swarm of locusts, an unstoppable force that devoured everything in its path. Nahum agrees they are like locusts, but points out what actually happens to cold, sluggish bugs when the cold night ends. But the very moment the bright sun rises, the terrifying swarm panics, scatters, and flies away into the morning sky. Still, Nineveh had its physical defenses. The city boasted walls up to 50 feet thick, wide enough for multiple chariots to ride side by side along the top. Looking at the reconstructed gates of the city, the sheer scale of the engineering is imposing. It was widely considered an impenetrable fortress. Yet Nahum laughs at these massive fortifications. He compares them to a tree full of ripe figs. The moment the tree is shaken, the fruit falls right into the eater's mouth. Before a superpower can physically collapse, its aura of invincibility has to be shattered. Nahum dismantled their pride on paper before the armies ever arrived at the gates. In 612 BC, the poetry became reality. A massive coalition of Medes and Babylonians marched on the capital to settle centuries of grievances. The attackers didn't even need to break down the famous walls. Nahum predicted a specific tactical failure. The local rivers would flood, hitting the city exactly where it was weakest. Raging floodwaters violently crashed against the foundations, rapidly dissolving the mud brick and tearing the impenetrable defenses wide open. Through that chaotic breach poured fire, swords, and the vengeance of nations. The City of Blood was completely sacked by the very people it used to victimize. The destruction was total. Nineveh was wiped off the map, its population scattered, and true to Nahum's word, the city was never rebuilt. The empire was reduced to a permanent ruin. For millennia, it was nothing more than a series of grass-covered mounds hiding in the dirt. God is notoriously patient, often giving mercy to the worst offenders. But when a system commits itself entirely to cruelty, his justice is absolute, and for those who trust in him, the end of evil is a promise of peace.